Dear all, it's my privilege to be back in Institute of Child Health webinar talk, and again, more privilege to speak in front of my teacher, Professor Apurva Ghosh. Thank you, sir, for giving the opportunity. And as you told, I'll be concentrating on the common things what we encountered. So the scheme of presentation is regarding suspicion of congenital heart disease, the shunt lesions, then just touching on the X-ray and its role in diagnosis of CHD, followed by rheumatic heart disease, the gray zone, and then Kawasaki disease, some important points. So everywhere, the salient important gray zones I'll try to discuss. 100 years ago, this we discussed in our last meeting also, Professor Alexander Nadas gave this Nadas criteria, and 100 years down the line, still it is relevant on an office practice. Major and minor criteria to suspect heart disease in kids. Systolic murmur more than 3, diastolic murmur, cyanosis, and heart failure. So one of any 4 will be sufficient to cause or suspect CHD. Frequently, we get the minor things, less than 3/6 systolic murmur, abnormal second heart sound, which may be sometimes very difficult to pick up, abnormal X-ray, abnormal ECG. So here lies the importance of getting an X-ray ECG in a suspected child, and abnormal BP in pediatric practice, as we discuss, at least once in per year for a suspected child, we should check BP. So if we get 2 minor criteria, then the suspicion of heart disease will be more robust, like a small short murmur heart with some cardiomegaly, abnormal ECG like RBBB pattern with some short sound. So these 2 things will in combination will be more powerful to suspect heart disease. The missed heart disease, frequently we come across a child where we have seen the child earlier, and the child comes back to our clinic with a suspicion or diagnosis of heart disease. So when we can miss? When baby is asymptomatic or relatively asymptomatic, particularly in a cyanotic baby. A cyanotic baby, everybody will pick up cyanosis, and that's a major criteria. When clinical features are subtle, and ASD is the prototype for missing the heart disease, it remains asymptomatic till 4th decade or late 3rd decade. The very important diagnostic point of an ASD is a fixed second heart sound split, which may be very difficult to appreciate in a busy OPD. More even, the second sound split can be present only in 85% of the cases. So 15% of the cases, the split will be normal, and this I refer to Horst clinical cardiology. This is usually not discussed, but yes, normal second heart sound and ASD. So if somebody has missed, it is not uncommon even for a cardiologist to miss. And the short murmur may not be considered very significant. It may be even a functional murmur. So how we can avoid it? If possible, a quiet room, but a pediatric room may be more noisy and difficult. Any suspicion, we should again re-examine the child. Thirdly, as per NADA's criteria, the chest X-ray and ECG are extension of clinical examination, and it should be sought, particularly X-ray, because it also is very common for pediatric practice for respiratory issue or otherwise. So it gives some valuable information. If clinical features are not convincing, these 2 will add up, like in an AHD RBBB pattern. So frequently what I get in a pre-anesthetic checkup, ECG done, RBBB found, and they are directed to cardiac clinic. So the ECG led to the diagnosis. Or another example of Professor Ghosh's patient I'll show, where an X-ray has led to some interesting diagnosis. So these are part of normal examination, no longer considered in cardiology as an investigation. Just I want to touch on the cyanosis and importance of pulse oximeter. Nowadays, I believe sir can confirm the checking of oxygen saturation is now coming to part of curriculum. Our bare eye cannot detect the oxygen level above 80 to 85 to 94. This range is difficult to pick up. That require a good oxygen saturation probe with a good pleth. So if we are getting good curve, then only we should consider that as a correct saturation. For the junior and fellows, I wish to just reiterate in the bedside quickly how to come across a cyanotic child, whether it is cardiac cyanosis or respiratory cyanosis. With oxygen, cardiac cyanosis is not going to improve. The reason being, the cyanosis in the cardiac patients is usually because of intracardiac right to left shunt. And when the child is crying, it will increase because of the increase in the shunt. For the respiratory cause, oxygen will help, and the crying child will be taking better breathing effort, thereby improving the oxygen delivery of to the lung. So that will be helpful for reducing the cyanosis. Thirdly, only rate of respiration increases in cardiac cyanosis, whereas the respiratory one will be retraction grunting. I think everybody is seeing the common LRTI presents with retraction grunt, less commonly with the pure cardiac cause. Cardiac cyanosis with secondary infection, yes, both can coexist, but I am just trying to discuss in a clean-cut case. Hyperoxia test, I know all know 100% oxygen for 10 minutes. The cardiac causes will not improve, whereas respiratory causes will improve. Cardiac cause, it will be below 100 millimeter of mercury in ABG. On pulse oxygen, pulse oximeter, it will be consistently low. There is no uniform number, but it will be definitely remaining cyanotic. Again, Institute of Child Health is the place where X-ray is taught at length. So I'm not going to go to detail of it, but just to touch on role of X-ray. ECG I have faded because that is.
Anil, can I interrupt?
Yes,
there are
please, sir.
Lots of people from outside the institute. So you consider their knowledge also.
Okay, so okay. I'll be more slow and I'll try to incorporate more in details. Okay. ECG I avoided today because it is a long discussion. I wish to add some important X-ray features which will be very, very important to pick up in the bedside. Heart disease is present. If it is, then which group it is. It is very, very important. In our pediatric cardiology clinic in Institute of Child Health also, almost all suspected heart diseases get an X-ray done. So what an X-ray tells to a treating clinician? Two things which is very important from cardiac aspect: the cardiac size and the pulmonary blood flow. These two important points differentiate the broad category of heart disease. So we discuss always congenital heart disease with increased pulmonary blood flow and congenital heart disease with reduced pulmonary blood flow. The traditional cyanotic and acyanotic no longer is very strictly practiced because there is overlap. Like the big heart, I think the X-ray is visible, very big heart with lot of plethora, increased pulmonary blood flow, what we consider as more than 5 end-on vessels on the peripheral field, especially in the lateral 1/3. So these are all end-on vessels. Most commonly, the left to right shunt lesions like VHD, PDA, and AHD will have these features. In cyanotic heart group, three common causes: transposition of great arteries. These are prototype, total anomalous single pulmonary venous connection and truncus. There will be other single ventricle physiology. One important point to consider in single ventricle complex heart disease group, where pulmonary blood flow is non-restrictive. That means there is no obstruction to the pulmonary blood flow. The saturation will be very high and baby will be apparently pink. So though the child has no cyanosis, but he has a complex congenital heart disease. So classifying just on basis of cyanosis may not be helpful in these situations. Rather, a holistic, comprehensive thing more useful. The second group is the congenital heart disease with reduced pulmonary blood flow. You can see these two X-rays I have put, and these two X-rays are showing heart, the pulmonary blood flow is reduced, more blackish, and classically seen in tetralogy of Fallot, or what we call as a TOF physiology, VHD and PS. Even TGA with VHD PS will come under the TOF physiology. We'll not go into details, but basically there is an obstruction to the pulmonary blood flow with VHD, and that will constitute TOF physiology. As we were discussing, tetralogy of Fallot child in early infancy or neonate period may be pink. In spite of being a tetralogy of Fallot, he'll be pink because pulmonary blood flow is well preserved. Similarly, tetralogy of Fallot with absent pulmonary valve. These are the two examples I have put as a common tetralogy variant where the child will be acyanotic, but it is a classical cyanotic heart disease. So based on the X-ray, we can classify whether pulmonary blood flow is increased or decreased. This will help to understand the physiology. This is the very, just a nutshell. The pattern recognition we always discuss: egg on side, TGA, figure of 8 or snowman sign, TAPVC, boot-shaped heart, tetralogy. These are very good to understand, and these are the prototype description, but these are not fixated. TGA can present with simply cardiomegaly with short pedicle and plethora, may not look like egg on side. Secondly, this snowman sign, what we tell, is a dilated superior mediastinum shadow. Usually we do not see these type of shadows before 3 to 4 years of age, because the veins should dilate. Supracardiac TAPVC we get. This vertical vein SVC also dilate to give the picture. So if we are seeing a bigger child, we may get this type of classic pictures. The common practice, we may not get it. So this prototype, why I put in a single slide to discuss, these prototypes are good to memorize, good to understand, and if we get, we are lucky. But frequently in common office practice, we do not get this classical presentation. What we get is a cardiomegaly, increased pulmonary blood flow, or the reduced pulmonary blood flow, and based on our cyanosis or associated finding, we try to identify. So I just tried to cover the common things, how common congenital heart diseases can be suspected, can be prevented from missing, and the importance of an X-ray. If we suspect a CHD, X-ray will aid in our diagnosis as a ECG. This is a case from Professor Ghosh. The patient, small infant, cardiomegaly. Here, pulmonary blood flow is not commendable, not very prominent. This is an X-ray we have taken from, is not directly taken. And there was concern for large heart. So one of the minor criteria definitely matched. So when it came to us, very interesting finding we found, there is a large thymus. So this is a short axis film showing the heart. This is the pulmonary artery, and this is the large thymic shadow. A large thymus in front of the heart is basically obstructing the heart and making a giant shadow. So if I compare the same X-ray, a fat man by the side of the thin man, and this is giving apparently a big man type shadow cardiomegaly. So only a echocardiographic evaluation can confirm, but clinically absence of other features possibly will help a clinician to come to a conclusion it's not a major heart disease. So quickly now coming to the common left to right shunt lesions, what decides timing of intervention? There are 4 factors: anatomy of the lesion, the hemodynamics, what we were discussing, the nature of the pulmonary blood flow, how much increased, how much symptomatic the baby is, and what type of intervention. If it is less invasive, can be done early, or more invasive, then possibly we'll have to wait, like individualized. Common lesions, 3 lesions I have picked up: ASD, VSD, and PDA, and just salient points when to intervene. That question we'll try to answer. How long we should follow up. Cyanotic babies eventually quickly will go to pediatric cardiac unit. The acyanotic child may remain for longer period. So ASD, when to recommend closure or when it should be, when early closure is suggested, and how we should close. First of all, why we should close ASD? Because the parents ask these questions frequently, that my child is absolutely fine, he's healthy, no symptoms, growing well, so why we should close? So the purpose of closure is to prevent development of symptom in adulthood. The left to right shunt lesion progressively will cause change in the cardiac dimension structures like right atrial enlargement, right ventricular enlargement. The enlarged right atrium is a nidus for creating a lot of arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, and which is very difficult to manage in adult life. Thirdly, a percentage of atrial septal defect patients will develop pulmonary vascular occlusive disease, that is so-called Eisenmenger syndrome, and reversal of the shunt in adulthood. So we don't want these 3 possibilities to develop in ASDs. ASD is more notorious because they remain asymptomatic in the pediatric age group or early adulthood, unlike VSD and PDA. VSD and PDA get symptomatic well ahead and demand early intervention. So pre-tricuspid shunt, the ASD will come to picture, unlike VSD and PDA. So ideal age for closure in asymptomatic child, 3 to 4 years of age, that is preschool. Before school, he should finish his surgery or device closure and then attend. So he will not have any memory of the procedure. In 10% of the cases with ASD, congestive heart failure, failure to thrive, or increased pulmonary artery pressure may be there. In those cases, early intervention will be required. Sinus venosus ASD, if it is diagnosed around 4 to 5 years, because surgeons require a little bit more space to operate. An adult, whenever it is diagnosed, we close it. I closed up to 64 years of age because it was very symptomatic and operable. So just an example, I have put 3-year-old boy with 11 kilo murmur, large ASD. So this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, RA-RV is dilated, and we can appreciate this was closed by a device. So an appropriate size double disc device was used. So we can see both discs have been deployed, and this is the post release echocardiogram showing a disc on both sides. This is a majority of the second-arm AHDs can be closed by device. Some AHDs with very significant deficient inferior margins cannot be closed, and those will go for surgeries. So what are the cases should go for surgery? I've enumerated primum AHD. Primum AHD is part of atrioventricular septal defect. We can see an image here. So this is ostium primum, patent ostium primum. Here it can be associated with an inlet VHD. This is a complex atrioventricular septal defect, and this cannot be closed by the device. Similarly, this is an ostium primum. Second is sinus venosus AHD. Sinus venosus AHD is basically high up, and it is basically a developmental error, not true AHD. In traditional circumstances, these also require device closure. And thirdly, I told very inferior AHD. There is nothing to hold. So this is an inferior AHD. This AHD, you can appreciate, is a centrally located AHD. This is the fossa ovalis region. This is the whole of the atrial septum. So if hole is there with good margin, then our devices will set. Otherwise, if it is below, it will not set. Usually not done. So these are the three indications where it should go for surgery. Coming to PDA, spontaneous closure, small PDA in full-term baby up to 3 months of age can get closed, but large PDA usually unlikely to close. So large or moderate PDA with congestive heart failure, pulmonary hypertension usually require early closure, and the timing of a large left to right shunt lesion usually closed by 3 to 6 months of age. Moderate PDA, no congestive cardiac failure, 6 months to 1 year. This is the traditional recommended time. If the child is failure to thrive, not growing, then we close early. But we always like to get a child little bigger because it is easy transcatheter to close the PDA. So this is an example again, 11-month-old, 7 kilos, so not that much weight. 3.5 is a relatively moderate sized PDA. This is just an example. This is aorta, this is pulmonary artery, this is the PDA shown by an angiogram, and this is the device which is held in place by cable and then released. By and large, majority of the PDAs can be closed by transcatheter means. Very preterm small baby may require surgery, but nowadays softer devices are coming up that also very useful for closing preterm PDAs. So what to do about small PDAs? Small PDA with mild left heart syndrome, no pulmonary hypertension or heart failure can be followed up, and closure is indicated. Closure is indicated at around 12 to 18 months of age. This was not an indication earlier in the surgical era, but in transcatheter era, the procedures are very much less safe, low risk, and closure is done usually to avoid risk of bacterial endocarditis, or some kids may have failure to thrive, and that also helps. Silent PDA, no murmur, no pulmonary hypertension, what we call as an echo PDA. One report with 1 millimeter PDA, no murmur, nothing. So we should not touch because it will be causing more harm rather than good. So now I'll come to an index case with a VHD. A 1-year-old child, 6.3 kilo, 98%, and clinical features of a VHD. ECG showing sinus rhythm and mild cardiomegaly with some increase in QP. So this echocardiogram again showing LALB mildly dilated. This is the VHD, which is restricted partly by the septal tricuspid aneurysm, and it is restrictive, which is indicative by the gradient between left ventricle and right ventricle. 70 is high gradient. That means right ventricular pressure is 70 less than left ventricular pressure. So this is relatively restrictive. So what to do? This is a very common scenario. A very large VHD with heart failure will go for surgery. When it comes to this type of scenario, when child is relatively lesser weight, what to do? So I'll just try to discuss the natural history of the VHD. Very large VHD, symptomatic spontaneous closure uncommon. Moderate to small defect, 30 to 35% close spontaneously by 3 to 5 years of age. So small defect, definitely wait and watch is the principle adapted, but moderate defect is the defect which creates maximum trouble. And VHD can get reduced in size in about quarter of a cases. When closed, VHD is the most common congenital heart disease, consisting of 35% of total congenital heart disease. So we should be very careful to recognize. I wish to tell for the juniors that large VHD with uncontrolled congestive heart failure or with coarctation of aorta, we should operate as soon as possible. Otherwise, VHD with severe PH without coarctation or other thing, we want pulmonary venous vascular resistance to come down, and 3 to 6 months is the ideal age for closure. We should not try to close before 3 months because the operative morbidity will be high, post-operative complications will be high. Moderate VHD with moderate pulmonary hypertension, the case as I was discussing is individualized. If the child is symptomatic, not gaining weight in spite of all therapy, then will require early closure. One exception to the rule is Down syndrome child. Down syndrome child, if it is even moderate VHD, we go ahead and close before 6 months of age because Down syndrome is very notorious to develop pulmonary vascular obstructive disease well early. So they may not give much time. Downs, that's why always considered a separate, and Downs clinically we may not be able to pick up heart disease, though there may be a large VHD sitting. So Down syndrome, that's why the dictum followed all across to get cardiac evaluation done, irrespective of clinical finding. Small VHD, dilated LALV, poor weight gain. So we close by 2 to 4 years. One group of VHDs, the small outlet VHD less than 3 millimeter without aortic valve prolapse, yearly follow-up, and if aortic regurgitation develop, that is an indication. I am telling these important things because frequently patient will reach to a pediatric OPD with a report. So if we know that it is an outlet VHD, outlet is very close to pulmonary valve and aortic valve gets prolapsed in the VHD and it damages itself. So we don't want to damage a valve. Early closure is indicated. So this is the surgery as we discussed. And the restrictive VHD 8 kilo, even now we have started doing lesser 6.5 kilo also because we have softer device. So if there is no aortic valve involvement, it is well margined, then we close it with device. So this is angiogram I am showing. This is the VHD device held by a cable, and then pigtail catheter showing complete occlusion of the defect. So coming to this index case again, possibly still we can wait because the birth weight was 2.1 kilo. So that fact is very important to consider and to take a decision that the child has not gained weight, but he started low. So we can give some more time. And if everybody is convinced that the child is not gaining properly in spite of all measures, then yes, we can go ahead and close depending on the anatomy of the defect. So I have just covered the shunt lesions and important decision-making points. Now I'll just try to touch the cardiologist's perspective for rheumatic fever. I think sir is there, he's expert treating so many rheumatic fever and bizarre variety. How we get involved and the variant, what we see. All of us know, so I'm not going to go in this detailed thing. All I want to tell what changed. In 2015, American Heart Association guideline, the revised Jones criteria, and it changed the Jones criteria in two parts, the traditional low risk population and high risk or moderate risk population. We are from high risk population. So Jones criteria for us is this side where our polyarthritis, in addition, polyarthralgia also is a major criteria, unlike in the past, as monoarthritis. So polyarthralgia and monoarthritis, this changed in this new criteria for high prevalence cases in major criteria. In minor criteria, monoarthralgia has come. So it is a big change in the criteria. Secondly, elevation of ESR to 30, whether we, in the traditional criteria, it was more than 60. So if a patient comes with monoarthralgia and elevated ESR and has an elevated preceding ASO titer or anti-DNSB titer, then possibly the child has more susceptibility for heart disease, rheumatic fever, especially if the child is having past history. So 3 minor has been included as a recurrent case. In de novo case, yes, 1 major and 2 minor. 2 minor changed as monoarthralgia and ESR is cut down, is only 30 now. So 3 minor in an old case of rheumatic fever will constitute as a reinfection. We all know arthritis carditis happen early. Chorea is a relatively late manifestation. So acute rheumatic fever, rheumatic nodule, multiple nodule to the bony prominences in the back, in the scapula, in the knee, in the elbow, in the forehead, is accompanied by, these are the anterior mitral leaflets showing small nodules. And this is a ECG showing prolonged PR. And this image from Kochi we published in Circulation in 2010. This is just to show how a rheumatic nodule is visible if somebody has not seen. And I was a little surprised to find the same image has been put in Mawson Adams' current textbook of cardiology. So the images were appreciated possibly, and it is good to have that kind of a visual impression. Erythema marginatum, it is taken from the textbooks. I have not seen. Sir possibly has seen his vast experience. Evanescent, in a fair skinned, it is easy to see evanescent rash with central halo, quickly changing, serpentinous, erratic. So if we get, that is one of the major criteria, and this is more academic interest, we should know. This is again an important point, Sydenham's chorea, relative late feature. Adolescent girls show a jerky, uncoordinated movement affecting hand, feet, and face. Characteristic feature, it disappears during sleep. You can see this is a video from Kochi. She's showing jerky movement of the hand. So they're all we know: milkmaid's grip, pronator sign, spooning, flexing and extension when hand is extended, and arms and palm turning outward when hand is held high. So these are the common things. This young girl showing this repetitive jerky movement without any cause, it should strike. And I wish to share another interesting video. This video is shared by my friend Dr. Indrajit Misra, who is a promising pediatrician in Diamond Harbour Hospital. You can see this child has a similarly jerky quasi-purposive movement. Also in the, we can see in the face, that child had a clinical mitral regurgitation. We can appreciate a little bit of chest movement, and that patient was diagnosed as rheumatic chorea and with carditis and treated accordingly. So once we see this, that may be an opportunity. Next case maybe in OPD and we'll be able to pick up. Coming to carditis, it will be pancarditis, and how to clinically diagnose the salient points: pericarditis, myocarditis, and endocarditis. For pericarditis, audible friction rub. Usually, rheumatic carditis is not associated with significant effusion. There can be mild effusion in the echocardiogram, but it is not significant anytime. If there is a large pericardial effusion, it goes against diagnosis of acute rheumatic fever. Valvulitis is always present. So pericarditis will have valvulitis, and it is important both primary and recurrent cases. Myocarditis we diagnose with cardiomegaly and heart failure. Endocarditis by holosystolic murmur of MR, with or without mid-diastolic Kericoombs. Kericoombs is very difficult to get. So what we get is a MR murmur. Early diastolic murmur of aortic regurgitation, which is less common because mitral valve is involved in 80% of the cases. Aortic valve maybe 20, or mixed group. 5% isolated AR. So 20% is the mixed lesion. Change in the character of the murmur in a previous RHD. So that we should be knowing a patient has an RHD and this type was the murmur and there is a new murmur. So clinically, how to diagnose whether it is mild, moderate, or severe? So let me be very frank, mild carditis is very difficult to diagnose clinically. Only feature is mild AR or MR, that is mitral or aortic valve regurgitation seen in the echocardiogram without heart failure. No cardiomegaly on X-ray or ECG. So this entity is a more or less echocardiographic diagnosis. We see mainly moderate and severe group, relatively easy to diagnose because cardiomegaly in X-ray, clinically audible murmur in apex, systolic murmur in apex usually indicate moderate MR. Mild MR, very difficult to appreciate. We can appreciate, but difficult to appreciate. So if we are getting a rheumatic fever child with cardiomegaly in the X-ray and clinically having a murmur of mitral regurgitation, so at least moderate carditis is there. This is, I am talking to all our juniors, how quickly to tell myocarditis is there and it is at least moderate. If there is significant heart failure and we are convinced that it is severe mitral regurgitation or severe aortic regurgitation, yes, it is severe carditis. Carditis is basically valvulitis, and that fact, more involvement of the valve will parallel. So it will be very easy for everybody to diagnose the grade of the carditis, because our treatment, why we are discussing this point is our treatment will be based on this carditis grading. So as I was telling, total anti-inflammatory therapy 12 weeks. How we will give this entity, arthritis and or with mild carditis, I don't come across much. Aspirin 80 to 100 milligram per kg per day in 4 divided doses, up to 6 to 8 gram per day in adult. With gastric protection once symptomatically better, usually 2 to 3 weeks. And then we can come down the dose to 50 to 60 milligram per kg per day. Naproxen can be given for aspirin intolerance or allergy, 10 to 20 milligram per kg. The variant what I observe is moderate to severe carditis, and prednisolone is the treatment of choice, 2 milligram per kg per day into 3 divided doses of maximum 80 milligram per day till acute phase reactants normalized. So weekly checking of the acute phase reactant and CVC is important. We, after 2 to 4 weeks, we taper 25% per week and then start the final week aspirin, 50 to 70 milligram per kg per day, while we are tapering steroids. So total therapy is 12 weeks, absolutely. Very rarely, I recall possibly 2 patients I gave methylprednisolone in 15 years. Very severe carditis, not responsive even to prednisolone. So methylprednisolone was given, and the child was rather underwent surgery early, relatively, because of the registered heart failure. Regarding rest, carditis or mild arthritis, 1 to 2 weeks, and then in complete hospital, 1 to 2 weeks, 1 to 3 weeks, house arrest, that means more restricted, and then school. In our scenario, it will be very difficult to follow exactly, like a moderate carditis giving for 4 to 6 weeks is extremely difficult. This is a guideline from AHA and Australian guideline, but we don't follow strictly what we follow. The child should be having less movement, house arrest type, and then once things are better, slowly he resume work. In severe carditis, yes, the child require more longer hospital stay, and once stable, then house arrest, or school activity should be delayed. The 2 to 4 month is a bit longer, but yes, that's the recommendation in an ideal scenario. We all know the primary prevention. I just want to reiterate the penicillin, penicillin, penicillin. Not only for primary prevention, treating the acute rheumatic fever, but also for the maintenance. Practically, resistance to penicillin is not reported to large extent, and still it is drug of choice. Benzathine penicillin G, that is Penidior LA, has the maximum efficacy. That's why still it is preferred, though patient may not like because of the pain associated and invasive, but still if it is possible and supply is good, we should try to give 6 lakh unit less than 27 kilo, and more than 27 kilo is 12 lakh unit intramuscular deep after skin test. Penicillin B is K-pen, and more commonly found is Pentid, is 200 and 400. That 10-day course, and that will continue as prevention. Penicillin G is always preferred. In penicillin resistant case, allergic patients, sulfadiazine possibly come in picture. Duration of secondary prophylaxis, again, I wish to stress on that if there is carditis with residual heart disease, that means there is some valvular disease which is persistent after 12 weeks of complete therapy, then that child will require 10 year or until 40 year. And now we tell lifelong. We all write lifelong because in India we have very high prevalence. So we should enforce taking penicillin till 40 years of age. With simple carditis, no valvular lesion after completion of therapy, minimum 10 years. Still, no carditis, yes, up to 21 year or 5 year. So this is a AHA guideline, and unfortunately, the education of the patient regarding the need of penicillin therapy, why he should take, is very important. Frequent discontinuation of the penicillin is very common, and that lead to rheumatic recurrence. And once recurrence, then valve will go away, and we don't have much option for pediatric population, mainly because small kids, I am seeing 9 year, just now one child underwent open valvotomy, 9-year-old, and double valve disease. So you feel helpless. You cannot do, you don't get correct size valve for the small child, unlike adult. So we should try to prevent by strengthening the penicillin education. This is Professor Ghosh's favorite topic, and frequently he sends patient a very tricky topic. One slide for this post-streptococcal reactive arthritis, a distinct form of acute rheumatic fever. It differs from acute rheumatic fever in some aspect, like it is relatively short in duration, in incubation period. Pharyngitis present in 2/3, low-grade fever in 1/3. The nature of the arthritis additive, persistent, non-migratory, and it involves small joint. So clinically, if the doubt is for acute rheumatic fever, the post-streptococcal reactive arthritis, the problem is treating acute condition is okay. What to do about penicillin prophylaxis? And that should be observed very carefully for several months. The recommendation is the patients should be observed for carditis and should be given prophylactic penicillin for at least 1 to 2 years post episode. And this is the whole crux. If somebody is diagnosing post-streptococcal reactive arthritis, then patient will require penicillin prophylaxis up to 2 years and on close follow-up. So this is an important aspect for post-streptococcal reactive arthritis. Now, few points. I think everybody, pediatric experts are the best person to treat and diagnose Kawasaki disease. I'll just touch important cardiac aspect as sir wanted, and how cardiologists get involved. The coronary involvement is in 30 to 50% nowadays, it is telling. So no coronary involvement in 60 to 75% cases in different series. Mild dilatation in the majority, and aneurysm seen in a smaller fraction. Myocarditis is 1/3. Nowadays, post-COVID era, we are seeing a lot of myocarditis. But otherwise, yes, it is seen, is common relatively. One preamble I just particularly put for our knowledge: what is the role of pediatric cardiologists in diagnosis of Kawasaki disease? It is a clinical diagnosis by pediatric team. They are the best judge. The Z-score of the coronary artery more than 2.5 in one coronary artery branch is seen in 0.6% of the normal febrile population, and more than 3 Z-score in 0.1% of the normal febrile population. So these 2 points are very important, that if a child has fever, in 1 in 1,000 cases, he will have a very dilated coronary. So that will not cause the diagnosis to be stapled as Kawasaki. 2 coronary, like a Z-score of more than 2.5 in both proximal right coronary artery and left anterior descending branches, will be very uncommon. So if we are getting 2 coronary artery branches are involved, that is more significant. But this will only add on to the clinical suspicion of the pediatric team. More than absolute dimension is very easy. We may forget the Z-score, or the calculation software may be erroneous. The absolute dimension 3 millimeter less than 5 year and more than 4 millimeter above 5 year is very, very handy information to diagnose that it is dilated. Z-score plus 2 to 2.5 is dilated. We all know still 2.5 to 5 is small aneurysm, plus 5 to plus 10 is large aneurysm, and more than plus 10 is giant aneurysm. The classification has significant importance in choosing the drug, choosing the follow-up time and the imaging and etc. Serial assessment depending on the nature of the coronary involvement is essential. One new concept has been incorporated in the recent American Heart Association guideline that a child may have clinical Kawasaki disease and coronary artery Z-score 1.9, which is by definition not dilated. But on follow-up, he is found to have more than +1 reduction. So the baseline we don't know. Baseline was possibly less. It got dilated in the disease process and reached up to 1 point less than 2. Still it is significant, but that we cannot diagnose. This is a retrospective diagnosis. So ultimately the diagnosis will be by clinical mean. If there is a large aneurysm or significant dilatation, that will definitely aid in diagnosis. And this mild dilatation usually resolves in 4 to 8 weeks. Why we fear? Cardiologists fear because there are 3 pathologic processes involved with the Kawasaki: necrotizing arteritis, vasculitis, and luminal myofibroblastic proliferation. So basically, the artery is getting dilated, they are getting thrombosed, recanalization, and then developing stenosis. So giant coronary aneurysm, that is more than 8 millimeter, do not resolve, regress or remodel. If it is a small coronary dilatation, it will have the normal slow regression or resolve. Very giant or very big will not do. So this will lead to complication. And these are some of the images I have just put as a prototype, multiple places, not only coronary. I think Dr. Priyankar Pal has published a nice image set of involvement of all peripheral artery having multiple aneurysm elsewhere. So like that here, we can see the aneurysm in the iliac, in the femoral, in the axillary, in the coronary. So giant coronary aneurysm, the problem, it can rupture and it can get blocked by a thrombus. So it can be occlusive, and markedly damaged aneurysm the media will get damaged and lumen diameter will get narrowed. So stenotic. As we progress, this stenosis will cause restriction of the flow and myocardial ischemia and infarction. And these are the fear factor in outer world, in the developed countries, these arteries getting stenting. One of the cause of stenting in adult life, the pediatric population followed is Kawasaki disease from pediatric background. Coming quickly to myocarditis occurs frequently, but the inflammatory changes, though it occurs before coronary artery abnormality, it does not cause any damage. It is inflammation only. No ischemia or permanent damage. There is the dysfunction usually respond to the therapy like inflammatory therapy, IVIG, etc. And it has a good outcome. Very promptly it responds. IVIG giving and steroid giving very promptly responds the severe dysfunction to normalized. One paper of Professor Pal with us, I think it got accepted in the current COVID era. So one example again quickly, 2-year-old, 11 kg, high fever, classic clinical Kawasaki disease, and the child received IVIG on day 7. ECG was not very significant, no STT change. But what to expect? What are the changes we should expect? Arrhythmia, SA node or AV node dysfunction, prolonged PR interval, non-specific STT changes because of the myocarditis, and low voltage if it is significant myocardial involvement. These are the features of ECG which will help to diagnose, and a baseline ECG will help to note what is the change happening in due course of time. So an electrocardiogram in unsuspected or diagnosed Kawasaki disease is always helpful for long-term follow-up. The same child, we found dilated left coronary artery with microaneurysm. So I wish to show, this is in short axis echocardiogram. This is the aorta. This is the pulmonary artery. This is the left main coronary artery. This is the left anterior descending LAD. And you can see here the LAD is developing an microaneurysm. This is like a rhomboid shaped Z-score more than +3 type. So whenever this microaneurysm is there, microaneurysm is less likely to be present in normal population. So diagnosis is confirmed and it require more intense anti-inflammatory anticoagulation that I'll come in next slide. This is another very interesting patient. This is also from Institute of Child Health. Very infant came in a very sick state and we diagnosed having a giant aneurysm. So one example of giant aneurysm I have just drawn. This is left artery. This is the right coronary artery. These are the right coronary artery aneurysm. This is a big globular aneurysm. Here there is a clot. If you can appreciate a small clot. The problem is the echocardiogram has a limitation. It does not show a great length, very distal, and a very giant aneurysm may have associated finding which may miss. So we wanted CT angiogram. The patient lost follow-up initially and elsewhere this CT done. This angiogram I got back and I wish to show, this is a catheter showing right coronary artery aneurysm. There are 2 aneurysms, and if we concentrate on this particular round pouch, there is a whirling of contrast signifying there is a possible loose clot or contrastasis. So that is not a good sign. And here, this is the left coronary artery which is showing irregularity. So this coronary angiogram was done possibly 1 year after the initial insult. And what I showed the images of acute condition and some sort of irregularity developed, and that we will not be able to pick up in our regular echocardiogram. So a baseline second imaging, depending on the index case, is a good thing for patients having giant or large aneurysm. All we know how to treat resistant Kawasaki, IVIG second dose plus prednisolone. I wish to add some point about infliximab. Nowadays, it is progressively being used in ICH also and with good outcome. So infliximab is a good coronary protector if acute phase reactants are elevated and patient is significantly symptomatic. If afebrile post IVIG with reduction of acute phase reactant, then possibly it has less role and anticoagulation will help. Quickly, we all know the heparin, regular unfractionated heparin used in thrombosis. One patient we gave TPA plus heparin and the child recovered. So there were 2 very large thrombus we followed and one was very sick, recovered. Low molecular weight heparin for chronic thromboprophylaxis for large or giant coronary aneurysm with history of thrombosis. Young infant, it is sometimes easy to give low molecular heparin than the warfarin, or bridging the patient to convert from regular heparin to warfarin. Warfarin is a standard drug, 0.2 to 0.5 milligram per kg per day with an INR target of 2 to 3. This is very brief. We all know AHA, clopidogrel as a triple therapy for very large aneurysm and dual therapy for smaller aneurysm. Dose 0.2 to 0.5 milligram per kg per day. Alteplase and this plasminogen activator for very large thrombus, occlusive thrombus, and the standard aspirin we know that is the most common regular therapy, 6 to 8 weeks for regular cases, 3 to 5 milligram per kg. This is the Kawasaki disease guideline. Some few points I have highlighted. The regular 6 to 8 week we should give. If there is an aneurysm, then anticoagulation may be considered, especially aneurysm which is not regressing, persistent. Is a good idea for patients developing aneurysm which is non-regressive. New guideline, I think we have started using statins for these patients having aneurysm, but the consensus, everybody still are not using. There is some concern. Very small child, myelination may be an issue. And very large giant aneurysm, yes, aspirin, warfarin, both plus minus, clopidogrel depending on the patient. Beta blocker is coming in recommendation, but still cardiologists are not giving regularly. But in the very large aneurysm, yes, statins we are giving. So this big chart, sorry. So the big chart, just to thrust on the point, the need of very robust anticoagulation therapy depending on the nature of the aneurysm and how it is regressing, progressing, or continuing. So if we keep a very strong follow-up evaluation in a teamwork, then only we'll be able to manage this difficult Kawasaki disease. So Kawasaki disease child require pediatric team, cardiac team, and a very close coordination for a better outcome. Thank you. I tried to cover all important aspects as you told. Getting only gray points. Only gray points. I have not dealt with us.
Very good presentation.
Anything?
I think Devosri, I will request Devosri to comment, because we are not cardiologists.
No, but sir, I have not discussed cardiology rather. Today's thing was more in pediatric practice, how we can better see, and it's good to see Devosri.
Yeah, it's a beautiful presentation, Anil Bhai. You have touched upon all the very important and most frequently asked questions, and you have summarized it beautifully in this 1 hour session. So yeah, I mean, you have done a great job.
I think some questions, sir can.
There is one question from the participants. For operation, any weight bar? Dr. Alok Pal wants to ask. Would you like to take that?
No. What?
For operation, is there any weight bar? I think
no.
Wait,
no. The thing is, this was an old concept which caused more harm. If an operation is required, it need to be done. The child will never gain that weight. That concept led to that majority of the diseases. No, yes, for tetralogy group, we can wait for some time. When it is indicated, tetralogy electively we operate at around 1 year of age. But some center, if they're experienced, they can take at 6 months of age. Not allowing surgery simply because weight is not fulfilled is no longer recommended. That is more harmful. I'm making a general statement, but case to case things can change. Weight is not important. The clinical status of the child is more important.
Yes, absolutely. Can't agree more, because previously there was a concept that 8 kilo or 8 kilo for tetralogy or 10 kilo for VSD. These concepts no longer exist. Today we are operating even small children as small 2.5 kilos. They're performing arterial switch operations and TAPPC repair.
Arterial switch is the best example, I think.
Weight is really no bar for us.
No bar,
correct. So whenever surgery is necessary, it has to be done.
And the VSD, if we tell 8 kilo, the poor fellow will never gain.
Never get to 8 kilo.
So he and these people will lost to follow up and have a high attrition. So the idea of weight we should take out. That's what I tried to break some of the gray areas, that active participation and orientation will help to salvage more correctable heart disease.
The same problem we face sometimes in cleft palate. I mean, these babies, they cannot eat properly and they don't get weight for many reasons. And the surgeons, they refuse to operate because the standard is that I will not operate before 8 kg. And by then, the ideal time for speech development is...
Exactly. You you touched the chord.
Exactly the same.
Absolutely same, sir. And 8, can you tell, sir, how the 8-figure magic number has come? Everyone quotes this number 8.
I don't know.
Maybe
But they,
something, because a lot of patients are becoming unoperable, sir. The problem what we face in VHD, the increased pulmonary blood flow causing pulmonary vascular obstructive disease, and patient is rendered inoperable. That is very, very sad for a complete correctable lesion.
And we don't see this, we do see this unfortunate things happening. They will come from a remote place and say, we were told that unless it is 10 kilos, no one will operate. So we never brought this patient to you. This do happen.
Anil and Devasri, what type of stethoscope and which company will you suggest? For the pediatricians? I mean, the residents, especially for the exams and their day-to-day practice.
Certainly Littmann, the dual mode Littmann. The one
sir,
with a small diaphragm, and on the other side there is a larger diaphragm for bigger children.
I agree on principle with Devasri, but I wish to share some interesting facts, sir. This is from the Amrita days. Dr. B.R.J. Kannan, our consultant teacher. See, he used to get the murmurs with the ward stethoscope having old diaphragm. So he used to tell, any decent stethoscope, if properly used, will be able to pick up majority of the cardiac findings. This is, I'm just trying to tell.
So this is
not
actually
having
the man
Littmann is not
machine.
a contraindication.
Man behind the machine, Anil bhai. It's not the
so,
machine.
More orientation is more important. Definitely having Littmann has a fantastic acoustic. I completely agree.
But I mean, for beginners, definitely the basic Littmann, cardio 3. That should be the basic minimum.
Sir, you a Littmann cost. I'm just thinking a Littmann cost 40,000 rupees. That is very good to have Littmann. But a regular stethoscope is good enough. A standard regular stethoscope of any good company. If properly somebody listens, the grade 2/6 murmur, definitely our residents will pick up. That is my belief.
Can I give you my experience?
Yes, sir.
I brought a stethoscope from USA, which cost 30,000 rupees.
Yes.
In that stethoscope, it's a Littmann. In Littmann, that will immediately show the heart rate. The moment you put, it will show the heart rate, and also you can increase and decrease the sound. That's fantastic. I am getting, but I don't suggest this for the beginners or for the examinees. But that's a fantastic stethoscope. I will send you a photograph of that one day, and that shows the heart rate immediately as soon as you put on the chest.
No, I completely agree. What Devasri told is it is very
the man
good.
behind the machine is the most important. That is definitely. But a bad man also can work better with a good instrument.
I agree, sir. So what you are telling, having a good Littmann stethoscope, definitely I love Littmann, and still I think I have a Littmann.
That's my suggestion. That's my suggestion to all my residents, that they should try to use Littmann always. Rather than having a good quality phone, they should have a good quality stethoscope.
Correct, sir. That is the clincher, sir.
Too, I mean, the Cardio 3 has the advantage that on one side you get a bigger diaphragm for a bigger child, or say a full-grown adolescent, and on the other side there is a small diaphragm for small children. So that really is useful.
The other trap you didn't mention is the dextrocardia. I mean, that's a nightmare. That's a nightmare in the exam. That's a nightmare in day-to-day examination also, day-to-day practice also. Very easy to miss.
I'll tell on a lighter note one thing, sir. I believe today I gave my exam. You know why? 45 minutes, you told me to cover all important aspects of gray zone in pediatric cardiology. I tried to encompass as much as, as I can. Very difficult. So I believe your expertise in bringing out all the gray zone will definitely be very helpful to all our students who are listening. So many diagnoses.
You have covered it well. That's what I wanted actually. And I think Somnath, will it be available in YouTube?
Sorry, কি বললেন?
ইউটিউবে এটা পাওয়া যাবে তো?
হ্যাঁ।
ঠিক আছে।
So that's very good, sir. So you have developed a full system of IP webinar. That I was not knowing that YouTube is also active.
Yeah, YouTube is
very
active.
good, sir.
Anil bhai, there is another question from the participants.
Yes, please tell.
It says in 2015 AHA criteria for rheumatic heart failure, subclinical carditis was given by echocardiography as a major criteria added. Was it? Please highlight.
I think earlier indolent carditis used to be one criteria.
Carditis is important for diagnosis or not?
Subclinical carditis is a major criteria, and echocardiography has been incorporated as one of the major tools for diagnosing this carditis. As I was telling, carditis will be difficult to diagnose clinically if it is mild, and echo has a big role. But this indolent carditis, subclinical carditis was in earlier criteria. Present criteria, I don't recognize that they have additionally put. If it is, I need to check, but I have not found.
If there is no, what the guideline says, if there is subclinical carditis present, which is not previously, there was no indication for echo unless murmur was heard. But now, once rheumatic fever is suspected, acute rheumatic fever is suspected clinically, the patient should be sent for an echocardiogram.
Oh,
and
I'll break somewhere here. That the question again, not echo, for a full evaluation, because what thing will be found where frequently the small things may be missed. If rheumatic fever is suspected, a cardiac evaluation should be done. If we are not giving, only arthritis also should get a proper evaluation, because we will get multiple additional point. And echocardiogram by WHO also now a standard practice to see the MR mild carditis, now an echocardiographic diagnosis. I have not gone to the details.
That can be considered as a major criteria for carditis, that although this is mild carditis.
Mild carditis also carditis.
Not clinically appreciable. This is subclinical. That is what it is.
So the name changed. Every 5 years they sit and put new name. Basically, carditis, if it is there, it is a major criteria. Whether by echo also is okay.
It
is showing rheumatic.
Even though it's not audible clinically.
No. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So even arthritis with MR, which is rheumatic MR, non-audible, that is a major criteria.
Yeah, but there are definite criteria to call when to call it's a rheumatic mitral.
I have not gone to those details.
Definitely, it's not necessary. No.
But as a pediatrician, my sincere advice is that whenever you get a chance, please do an echocardiography at least once. If any doubt,
yes, sir. I completely agree.
Don't rely 100% on your clinical examination.
This mild, that's what I was trying to tell, sir. The mild carditis will be very difficult to pick up, sir, clinically. So nowadays, progressively, WHO has come with a specific criteria of diagnosing mild carditis by echocardiographic assessment, jet length, jet width, velocity, everything they have specified. And multiple studies have been done in India as well as in African subcontinent, where this echocardiography was used as a mass screening, and they picked up a lot of these so-called subclinical carditis. So cardiac evaluation is a must thing, as you are telling, sir. You always send, even for the post-streptococcal reactive arthritis, 2 of your cases where we kept on 2-year penicillin prophylaxis. So no carditis per se. So having a cardiac evaluation is a good idea always, sir.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, Devasri.
My pleasure, sir. Always.
Thank you, sir. It's a great session. Great session, Anil bhai.
Thank you.
Similar again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.